And then they try to convert each other.
What?
And then they die.
Never gets old. Welcome back to your favorite podcast, That Would Be Rad, a podcast that majors in 80s and 90s nostalgia, comic culture, all things paranormal, and minors in retro video games, tabletop RPGs, pre-internet mysteries, and raising our kids to be half as cool as we were back in the 80s. I'm your host, Tyler Bentz, and this is your other host,
Woody Brown.
Hey, man.
Dude, everyone, I think, can agree when they hear this statement. If we didn't have enough to worry about, just being an adult in this crazy world, the topic that we're talking about today, like, I've got to worry about just like I'm sitting here and all of a sudden I just catch on fire, bro.
Yeah, this is sort of a classic. When you brought this up, I immediately, because I don't know about you, but I feel like we haven't really heard about it in a long time. Yeah. But like as a kid, like back in the day, it was like, you know, it was sort of like Bigfoot, Loch Ness, Bermuda Triangle. And then in that next couple was like usually spontaneous human combustion. Right. And I've always been fascinated with it. So yeah, let's get into it.
Here's part of the reason why I was kind of attracted to this topic for today. Partially because, to be honest, well, I have to give some credit, although I'm sure there is an episode, I haven't seen it yet, but just, you know, watching the X-Files from the beginning, I'm just kind of like in this mood to like talk about just these unsolved, weird mysteries that have occurred, you know? And growing up and throughout adulthood, up until this point, really, when I think of spontaneous human combustion, I always think like, you know, there's this like kind of crazy fire marshal Bill comes to the scene and just like, let me tell you something. You know.
Which, by the way, that was such a weird character.
Very weird, but hilarious.
Yeah.
Boy, this hospital is an accident waiting to happen. Let me tell you something!
You know, like, I always thought that maybe they come in, they investigate the source of the fire, and they're just like, well, there's this, you know, really dark spot, and that's where the fire started, and it burned down the whole house.
Right.
But, you know, as I was reading through this, that's not it at all. And so that made me fascinated, which made me kind of dig deeper, and here we are. So I'm sure most of our listeners have maybe heard of spontaneous human combustion, or at least kind of, you know, debunked it in their minds before as they were growing up. But the truth is that even today, there's not really a good explanation for why or how this happens.
Yeah.
So spontaneous human combustion is a well-documented phenomenon where a body ignites and burns without any known contact with an external source of fire. In some cases, the damage is slight, and we'll talk about some of those. But in most, and frankly, the most interesting ones, as morbid as that sounds, the victim is basically reduced to ashes, and sometimes in the strangest cases, just partial bone, you know, like a skull or like a foot is left behind, completely charred. And then whatever they were on, whether it's a chair or a sofa or a bed, basically escapes relatively unscathed. Now, that fact is kind of what really drew me in. So we're talking about people coming upon a heavily burnt, charred body, laying on something or sitting on, or, you know, previously sitting on something. And that chair or that sofa or that bed, the sheets or even hay, we'll see, not burnt. These are items that, especially back in the day, I would think would be extremely flammable.
Well, you're leaving out one thing too. When I was kind of looking through it, there's also like a decent amount of reports where, you know, if they found somebody laying down, I think was sort of the common denominator with this. But like you would find, you know, the carpet charred underneath them, but then also they would find charred sort of area above them on the ceiling, which I thought was like, I'd never heard that before until looking it up now, which was pretty fascinating, which means like This must be kind of like a pretty big sort of blast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Well, and we'll talk about
Not cool, but
yeah, I don't know. I know what you're saying. It's fascinating. What's interesting too is cases of spontaneous human combustion began to appear in medical reports as far back as the 17th century.
Yeah.
By the 20th century, even like literature just had tons and tons of detailed accounts of these inexplicable human incinerations. It was kind of so commonplace back in the day, like in the 19th century, in the 1800s and so, that like even famous classical authors would utilize this in their stories. The most famous example, of course, is Charles Dickens' 1853 novel Bleak House, where a character, this sleazy alcoholic junk merchant named Mr. Crook, which, hey, man, a little on the nose, you know? Like
a little bit.
He ends up just as a heap of ashes on the floor and, quote, a dark, greasy coating on the walls and on the ceiling.
Yeah. I think Jules Verne even killed, I guess, like, one of the things about it is like it was a way for authors to like kill off your bad guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what I read too is like Mark Twain, Herman Melville, Washington Irving, a bunch of authors basically. And of course, TV shows and stuff have kind of talked about it. If it's okay, I think we should just kind of dive into some of these old cases.
Oh man, I love it. Let's get into it.
And as we do, I think listeners, you're going to begin to sort of see what Tyler and I saw as we started reading through these. There's some patterns, there's some similarities, but then it's just like they're so weird, right? And sure, the time period, because one of the first ones we're going to go to happened in the late 1600s. You know, it's easy for us to all think, well, you know, they didn't even know what the heck was going on back then. But as you'll see, as we get into more modern cases, it's just bizarre. And then we'll talk about kind of like theories and what we think and all that.
Which, by the way, I'm always a little like, it's funny, I used to think this way, but like as you sort of begin like researching stuff, kind of like, you know, we do on a weekly basis, like I've kind of gotten away from that cultural sort of elitism of like everything in the past was, you know, they were all idiots and they didn't know anything. I've kind of gotten away from that where I think it's just, you know, yeah, there's some societal things that have changed, but like, I think they were just as intelligent as we were. They just thought in a different way, you know?
Yeah. And there's some certain things like that we'll talk about in terms of like early theories that you'll see what I mean by that. I mean, I certainly don't want to discount the, you know, those that have gone before us. But, you know, I think we've also learned a lot since then as well. Like in some cases, they're just like so close to being right, but then they're like, I mean, anyway, you'll see. All right. So
after these messages, we'll be right back.
There's something out there waiting for us. And it ain't no dead.
America's future can be determined by our dreams and our visions.
It was very intense, bright light.
For over 200 years, there have been reports of giant man-like creatures.
From another dimension, another world, I don't know.
The most intriguing mystery on the North American continent.
Hey, this is Bryce Johnson from the Bigfoot Collectors Club, and you're listening to Tyler and Woody on That Would Be Rad, because that is rad.
One of the earliest well-attested cases of spontaneous human combustion was recorded by Thomas Bartholin in 1673. There was this kind of poor lady who was mysteriously consumed by fire in Paris. Now, it was known that she had been a heavy drinker of, quote, strong spirits, to the point of not taking almost any nourishment for 3 years. So, in other words, she was just on a bender, the likes of which, you know, nobody that we know personally has ever been on. I mean, 3 years where she just basically drank all day, every day. What I'm trying to say is this lady knew how to party.
Yeah.
Okay, poor thing. So one evening, she went to sleep on a straw pallet and was completely consumed by fire during the night. In the morning, only her head and the ends of her fingers were found. All the rest of her body was reduced to ashes. And this one is kind of strange, but kind of interesting as well. So this is also in France, and there was a guy named Claude Nicolas Lecat, which, dude, what a last name, you know?
Yeah. Also, how many lives were burned up?
Well, certainly, hopefully not 9. He was a physician serving as an apprentice surgeon in Reims, France, where he stayed at a local inn. The innkeeper, Jean Millet, had this, reportedly, nagging wife who got drunk every day. So another lady that she just wants to loosen up. She just wants a glass of wine. She wants to make her relax, okay? On the night of February 19th, 1725, the inn was full of people in anticipation for this big fair that was going to happen the next day. Millet and his wife, Nicole, went to bed early. You know, they got to get their rest. They got to chill out. Millet couldn't sleep, and she got up to go downstairs into the kitchen, probably into, get a glass of wine or two.
Little boozing.
Just sit down, warm herself up by the fire, drink. Her husband, of course, fell asleep, but around 2 o'clock in the morning, he woke up just completely startled. He smelled fire and rushed downstairs, banging on doors along the way to wake up any sleeping guests. He thought it was an emergency. He was trying to get everybody out of there. When the panic group arrived in the big kitchen, what they found burning was not the inn, but the innkeeper's wife. She was lying close to the fireplace and was almost totally consumed by fire. Only part of her head, her lower limbs, and a few vertebrae remained. A small section of the floor under the body had been burned through, and the chair she usually sat on next to the fireplace was just slightly scorched. But nothing else in the room was even touched by fire.
Hold on, and let's be real clear on that. Only a few vertebrae remained.
Yeah.
It takes incredibly high heat.
We're going to talk about the temperature.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we can now if you want to.
Yeah, let's do it.
So I had to look that up. It's kind of a weird thing to have in your Google search history, but apparently to cremate a body, you're talking about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit in order to reduce it to ash. Okay. And a real quick personal story here, super sad. One of our, if you're a new listener, I don't even know, I think I've talked about him before, but anyhow, my family and I, we have pet chickens that give us eggs and stuff. And one of our chickens died a couple weeks ago. And I investigated, I couldn't determine why. So I thought it could have been an illness. To save the other birds, the flock, I, obviously removed the chicken from the coop and gave it the old Viking burial, which is, put it on a funeral pyre and
burn it with a blowtorch.
Well, I don't have a blowtorch, but I did burn it. And I got to tell you, man, what I thought was going to be just like a real quick thing just took forever. And not funny enough, the fire had to get really, really hot and burn for a long time to reduce this thing to ash. That was my goal because I didn't want the kids coming out in the backyard and seeing like a bird skull or something. We're pretty attached to these chickens, and so it was kind of a traumatic event for me, to be honest with you. I'm certainly not cut out to be a farmer, I guess. But
I'm sorry for your loss.
And thank you.
We're all sorry for your loss.
And truly, I'm never eating chicken again. Anyway.
But, I think everybody out there is going to ask this question. How did it smell? Did it smell like barbecue chicken?
For a second it did, and it was just weird though, man. Yeah. It was just super sad. But anyhow, 3,000 degrees, man, is so hot, right?
Yeah.
And so just for fun, I looked up, how hot is a wood-burning fireplace? Because when we have a fire roaring in my house, man, you stand pretty close to it, and it's hot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And because this lady was sitting next to the fire, that was my first thought too when I first read this. Well, maybe she got super drunk. She kind of fell over close to the fire. Mm-hmm. She had something flammable on her, or perhaps there was maybe she spilled her glass, and the fire kind of like followed the trail up to her, and she caught fire.
Which I do think we should point out that like a lot of these older cases, were somewhat near the fireplace, like in the living room. Yeah. But I mean, honestly, if you're looking at it like, I mean, when was this? Like, what was the year? It's like way back.
1725.
Yeah. So you also have to look as like, okay, we didn't have like heaters, so you're pretty much at all times in the living room next to the fire to keep warm. Yeah. So,
and a lot of those old fireplaces too, there wasn't like a what's it called, man? Like the hearth. 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 I really do want to know that.
You nailed it.
Okay, cool. Anyways, it was just like flush with the floor. I don't know if you've ever if you go and Italy or whatever, some of those fireplaces you just put the wood. It's just right there, it's just right there on the thing. Anyway,
it's almost like a big like pizza, like brick oven.
Yeah, a couple things there. One, there would be maybe some scorched trail. Maybe not if let's just follow that theory and thinking like, well, what if the alcohol like evaporated or it was just barely there and it just burned? Would you be able to see that? I don't know. But here's the thing: like, even if she was passed out, drunk, for the fire to get that hot that quickly. Man, I mean, I feel like she would make some sort of noise, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, maybe she fell down and knocked herself out. Okay. But in that time, she's going to wake up at some point, right? I don't know. Anyway.
Well, which kind of leads me to the natural conclusion of like, I mean, it has to happen so fast. I mean,
yeah.
That to me.
Very hot, very fast.
Because like in order to even remotely like contain that hot of a, fire, without it just blasting and like burning everything around
everything else. Yeah, exactly.
It has to be just like super fast.
Because that's another thing, going back to the chicken comparison, because it was so long, if that was like in a contained area, like indoors, that would potentially scorch the ceiling, or there would be smoke marks on the ceiling, or, everything else around it would get burned up, And I mean, there was a point when the fat of the chicken made the fire burn more. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit when we talk about the scientific stuff about all this. But, what's interesting too about this case is because, I mean, luckily for this innkeeper, because Lecat was there and was a physician, he actually had to testify in court on behalf of the innkeeper because the police actually arrested the innkeeper for murder, bro.
Holy cow.
Because they're like, because everybody knew she just nagged this guy all the time, right?
they just sort of
like the first thing on the top of their head wasn't like, oh, she just sparked fire. They're like, no, the husband like pushed her into the fire, burned her up.
He had enough.
Yeah, exactly. So Lecat, because he was staying there at the inn, basically testified on behalf of the innkeeper and kind of saved him. So,
which really, by the way, Lecat, like that just sounds like an old school like detective, almost like a Columbo.
Claude Nicholas Lecat.
Man, that's awesome.
That is cool.
I like that.
Now we're going to move over to Italy. We're going to leave France and move over to Italy. And this happened just a couple years later in April of 1731. The Countess di Bandi of Cesena, Italy. She was 62. And even though she was 62, which, I mean, gosh, dude, 1731, that's probably pretty old, right?
Yeah, for sure.
She was relatively spry. And one day they noticed, like, at night she was really kind of lethargic and kind of just, not really herself. So she went to bed early, and the maids closed the door, let her fall asleep or whatever. They noticed the next day that she didn't wake up at her normal time. And so when they went in to check on her, nobody answered, and they opened the door, and 4 feet from the bed, there was a heap of ash, 2 legs untouched from the foot to the knee with their stockings on. And then, like, the lady's head, back half of the skull. And 3 fingers. The air in the room was also observed to be, like, almost as if, like, soot was, like, floating in it. There was a small oil lamp on the floor that was covered with ashes, but no oil in it. 2 candles and candlesticks up on a table still stood upright. In other words, they didn't fall over. Both of the cotton wicks were untouched, meaning, they weren't lit. The bed, no damage. Blankets and sheets were only raised on one side, as if like when a person rises up from bed.
Weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is weird that in most of these cases, like there's never an account of somebody like hearing like screaming or yelling or that you would imagine would accompany somebody, catching on fire.
There's some cases where, because I was curious to see like, okay, if this can happen, right? Almost all the cases are people find the victim and a couple of pieces of them and then just ashes or whatever. But does it ever happen in real time, so to speak? Like, are there any survivors? And in fact, there are. There's this Italian priest who actually caught fire during one of his devotions.
Wow.
And this was like in 1776. He'd been traveling around the country and arrived in the evening at a house of his brother-in-law, and he was left alone to pray. And a few minutes later, they heard this like crazy noise from the room. It was the priest crying out in agony. The people rushed in there, and they found him on the floor, just kind of like extended on the floor, surrounded by a light flame that receded as they approached and finally vanished.
Well, that's just the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. I mean, my goodness, dude.
But he was okay, though?
Yeah, so the skin on his right arm was, like just burnt off. It's kind of grotesque. So if you are grossed out easily, I encourage you to just cover your ears for a second. But like the skin on his right arm was almost entirely detached and hanging from the bone. From the shoulders to the thighs, the skin was equally injured.
Like his
just
sides, I
burns.
guess?
Like, we'll call them like third-degree burns, man. He actually died 4 days later because, geez. He just he succumbed to the injuries, basically.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing, too, that, a lot of them, like you're saying, they do happen to be like, they were completely just like obliterated, in this like confined area. But there are also cases where the skin isn't burned, the like fingernails, hair, cartilage that's like sort of your soft bits, like your like nose and ears, those are left completely fine, which kind of like goes against what I've sort of always assumed that it was, and we'll get into that later. But like, it is weird where there are some cases where it's like it's like even like organs and stuff aren't even burned. Man, it's like only in like certain little like super, super confined areas.
Yeah. Which like, if that would actually make more sense to me if it was just like, a human body is just on fire. Like because it takes so long and so hot. The temperature required is so high that, that would make sense if stuff was left behind. But the fact that like, it's just super concentrated in one area, or there's just like one thing left, it's just super, super strange. I mean, there's just a bunch of these early cases. There's one where this like soldier.
Is this about the night?
No. This is just like a small account. He was basically like this English soldier in the late 1800s, like 1888. Was pretty intoxicated and didn't have a place to sleep. So he just kind of like walked into this horse stable and laid on a pile of hay. And the next morning he was found completely consumed by the fire. But all of this, obviously extremely flammable hay around him, both loose and in bundles. For those of you that are like, well, if it's a bundle of hay, it would require a lot more kinetic energy to light on fire. I'm talking to my brother at this point. Both of those weren't even scorched.
Yeah, see, that's fascinating, man. Right?
But I'm going to fast forward a little bit because I mean, like, again, there are so many of these where there's a similar thing. Some of them have that sort of alcohol was involved pattern. Many of them are just very, very, very strange. So,
sorry, by the way, I think the stigma of like the alcohol was, kind of like the rum that you showed me the other night. Like it was a lot more commonplace for like everybody to drink back in the day.
Yeah, man, the Royal British Navy received a ration of this rum every single day.
So cool, man. But the the idea that like your immediate response is like, oh, well, they were, super drunk, which, I mean, by the way, I think like I always just sort of have looked at this, as like a true believer who, likes to look into and believe a lot of these really bizarre things we talk about. But with this, it's weird because I've always just kind of had a much more sort of mundane explanation of like, okay, well, there's all these gases inside of us and, with like fat and then like alcohol content involved, like they all just like go hand in hand. And I don't know how these sort of components work with each other, but, eventually we'll figure it out. It's just tied into a much more sort of mundane situation. But I don't know that the alcohol really has much to do with it.
Yeah. And I mean, since you're talking about it now, I'll say that like, I think when folks have kind of explored these theories, one of them, of course, being that like, look, they probably drank too much because they had a higher alcohol content in their blood. They were a little bit more flammable. What they've kind of found out is the concentration of alcohol in even the most intoxicated people are much too low. And even still, they would need an external source of ignition, right? Now, okay, am I saying that like every single one of these cases, somebody just didn't fall asleep with a cigarette in their mouth kind of thing? No. But man, like fire forensics and stuff have gotten pretty dang advanced. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the movie Backdraft.
Man, it's been a long time.
But, they're able to kind of tell and like recreate the scene and all that kind of thing. I don't know, man. Like, I don't think that you could drink. Now, that lady that drank for 3 years straight.
Yeah.
She may have.
Well, even if it's not the sort of the linchpin of like what causes this thing, I'm sure that like it didn't help.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But you can't just say, oh, well, it was alcohol when there's like these cases of like someone's head still there and then like they're from like the mid, shin down, they're still their feet in their socks and their shoes.
Right.
It's like, come on.
It's very strange. So this one is really interesting because this is really kind of what's been known as like one of the first times that so many, like at the time, every single possible tool of modern scientific investigation was used to figure out what the heck happened here. So this is 1951, and it's concerning the death of a Mrs. Mary Reeser of St. Petersburg, Florida. She was found reduced to ashes in a practically undamaged apartment. And, I mean, the FBI, fire officials, arson experts, pathologists, a year they investigated this thing, and they still turned up nothing. They could not figure out how it actually happened and left the case open. This physical anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Medicine, Dr. Wilton M. Krogman, who's a world-renowned expert on the effects of fire on the human body, finally gave up trying to understand what had happened and said, quote, "I regard it as the most amazing thing I've ever seen. As I review it, the short hairs on my neck bristle with a vague fear. Were I living in the Middle Ages, I'd mutter something about black magic." Isn't that insane?
Yeah.
So the kind of the details about her is she had gone to St. Petersburg, Florida to see and visit her son and his family. She had like an apartment down there, and she kind of went to bed early. The rest of the family was kind of out or whatever. A nearby neighbor in another apartment could kind of like see through her window, and they saw that she was, wearing her nightgown and a housecoat and black satin slippers and was lounging in a comfortable chair smoking a cigarette. The bed covers had been turned back, and Mrs. Reeser's last night was a typical summer night in Florida. The sky was overcast with occasional flashes of heat lightning in the distance. The neighbor woke up the next morning at about 5 a.m. and she noticed this weird sort of smoke odor. And, she wasn't that alarmed because she said that it kind of smelled like the water pump in the garage that had been kind of overheating lately. Kind of like that electrical burn sort of smell.
Yeah.
Which would freak me out, but okay. She got up turned off the pump and went back to bed. But when she got up an hour later to collect her newspaper outside, she no longer smelled any smoke. But around 8, a telegram arrived for Mrs. Reeser, and Mrs. Carpenter, this neighbor, signed the receipt and went to Mrs. Reeser's apartment. When she put her hand on the doorknob, it was like extremely hot. And as we all know from growing up in the 80s,
oh yeah,
that's one of the things that you do. You touch the doorknob, and if it's like super hot, that means there's a fire on the other side of it. And so this lady kind of freaked out. She started shouting for help. 2 painters that were working across the street ran over and opened the door. As he entered, he felt this like extreme blast of hot air. And, looking around to try to find out where Mrs. Reeser was so that he could rescue her, he frantically looked over to the bed. It was empty. There was some smoke in the air, but the only fire, he said, was a small flame on a wooden beam over a partition that separated the living room and the kitchenette. When the firemen arrived to put out this little small flame, they were kind of just taken aback. They couldn't believe it. In the middle of the floor, there was this charred area, roughly 4 feet in diameter, inside of which he found a number of blackened chair springs and the ghastly remains of a human body, consisting of a charred liver attached to a piece of the spine, a shrunken skull, one foot still wearing a black satin slipper.
Yeah.
And of course, a small pile of ashes. So this is the one that, I think is maybe the most famous, right? Because of the shrunken head or the shrunken skull.
Which, oddly enough, I found several that have the same kind of phenomenon. And I don't really understand I don't even know what to make of that.
Yeah, I don't really know either, man. And I mean, this is the one, again, that they investigated for a year and just never could figure out what the heck is going on.
And are you saying that the partition area that was on fire, that would have been above her, kind of like what I was saying with the ceiling, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, that's interesting, man.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one thing that I've been thinking on this, and I know this is super far-fetched, but there is and again, I don't know how it even would remotely tie into all these super old cases, but there is an element of energy weapon, that, if you're looking at it in a science fiction sort of.
Yeah, like a laser or something.
Yeah, I mean, it really kind of feels especially these that are only the ground or the carpet beneath them were charred and the ceiling above them. It just feels very directed, It's interesting.
Well, and I think another thing that pops into people's heads other than laser beams and or lightsabers is, well, what about lightning?
Yeah.
Maybe a bolt of lightning flashed in there and just, zapped her. Well, they had.
Well, or ball lightning.
Yeah. I mean, they had a guy come in who was an authority on all kinds of different burns and stuff. And, initially kind of considered lightning as a cause, but an engineer who specialized in the effects of lightning bolts on the human body basically flatly dismissed the theory because lightning was not reported in the immediate neighborhood, but also just the way that, I guess, appeared. It just it didn't follow a pattern that would make him believe that it could have been lightning. Another theory being that maybe, she was drowsy because she had taken a sleeping pill and, fell asleep with a cigarette. But the gown or the chair was flammable enough, according to these guys, and there wasn't enough material in these items to produce this, again, intense heat. Yeah. It would be necessary to reduce a human body to ashes.
Well, and also, I think you're leaving out also, it's the idea that there was still another satin slipper that, you're telling me that if she, let a cigarette burn her up, that it wouldn't burn that super combustible, easily
and the foot
burned.
too, man.
Yeah, on your foot.
The foot.
Your extremities
burned, and it had this slipper.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the one I think that you kind of hear about the most, I think, really.
I do remember some of those old books, that we would have way back in the 80s as kids, and whenever they would show this, they would always show just the chair, like an old lazy boy. And I will say this, I mean, I ran across a couple people in their 40s, but I feel like most of all, they're like fairly older people.
For the most part, it is older folks. And I mean, there are some, like you said, in their 40s. Like there was a guy in Louisiana who was 46, same kind of deal. I think, but yeah, you're right. I mean, for the most part, a lot of these are 60 and up. There are a few outliers. There's like a 19-year-old in the 1950s, a 30-year-old in 1959, and same kind of thing. So basically, a lot of times when these things happen, most of the time, people and authorities just kind of chalk it up to like, we don't know, or, must have been an electric malfunction, or, so like the kind of source material that I'm using is from one of the old books that we have in the That Would Be Rad library. And it only kind of goes to, late 70s or so. So I'm curious, were you able to find any sort of more, I don't know, like immediately I'm thinking, well, why don't we hear about this kind of stuff happening now? Because it happened quite often in the 1700s, 1800s, and then like the 1950s and that kind of thing. Did it kind of die down, or is this something that still kind of mysteriously still pops up every now and then?
Well, so I like you assumed, because when we were growing up, it was like a bigger thing. But I guess we just haven't really heard much as we've gotten older, and so I kind of assumed that it had just sort of disappeared. That like, well, maybe we kind of figured out or linked it to something that was taking place back in the day. But to my surprise, I found out that there was a woman in Germany in 2015 who was just sitting quietly on a park bench. She had several like people around her that like all witnessed it, wasn't smoking, didn't drink, and out of nowhere she was completely engulfed in flames, which was pretty amazing. For some reason, I couldn't find if she had passed away or not, but they said that, at the time that she was like basically fighting for her life in a hospital in Germany, but that was kind of crazy. There's another one that I found, which at the time, I don't know if there has been since, but this was the most recent or more modern case in December of 2010 in Ireland. Basically, a guy named Mr. Faherty was found with severe burns, lying on his back with his head near an open fireplace. Despite the blaze, the sitting room was completely untouched, apart from burns on the ceiling, directly above him, and on the floor directly beneath him. And so this was sort of an important case because I think it made a lot of the forensic experts, that had investigated the scene at his home, at the time, it sort of made them open back up the idea of, hey, this actually kind of fits into the category of spontaneous human combustion. Because I guess it hadn't, like what we were talking about, they hadn't seen anything like it in, years and years. There was another case in 2008 where basically a blue flame emanated from this lady named Jenny Saffin, who was 61 years old. She just sat with her family, they're just all sitting around, and they said she began roaring like a dragon, and emitting blue flame out of her mouth.
Man.
And her family was just completely awestruck. They had no idea, what happened. And that is another thing too, is this the blue flame. I think that's pretty interesting as well. I mean, you would probably know more than me, but would that link it more to like a gas type?
Maybe like, or like some sort of chemical that is potentially in the body.
Right, right.
Yeah. So like, just as an example, like certain chemical compounds, I'm sure if you've, I don't know, one of the common tricks in like early chemistry classes is like the teacher comes in, they're like, and to hold this in the Bunsen burner, and it changes the flame to green.
Right,
or
right.
blue.
Yep.
So like copper chloride and butane kind of burn with a blue flame.
I know back in the day when we would do the old milk carton melt it. So you would get it for all the folks out there that never did this.
Like a plastic milk carton?
Oh, it's amazing. It's so bad
man.
for the environment too, but it's awesome. Basically, get a stick. You'd put like a big, like, gallon. I guess, is that a gallon milk carton? Like the big ones?
Mm-hmm.
On the end of a stick, you light it, and we'd have like G.I. Joes under it. But as it melts, it starts like yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it would be that green kind of flame.
I remember too, like as kids, like we didn't know that it was bad, and so it was like, I don't know, man, burn this trash bag. Yeah. Whoops.
So cool. One thing that I did find, and I don't know if you found this too, but there was a scientist that, I guess, to sort of test this theory, I guess it's called like the wick effect, where it suggests that human fat will combust on a basically like a wick, like clothing or whatever, anything that it's on top of. And the scientist named Mr. Ford would marinate abdominal tissue from pigs in acetone, which is a highly flammable substance, which the body produces in reaction to alcoholism, fat-free dieting, and diabetes. And basically, it would burn to ash within half an hour. I don't know that this explains it per se, but I am wondering now if...
Well, here's the thing. Like, this goes back to my chicken burial.
Yeah, there you go.
I will say that once it got to a certain point, when the fat kind of took over and was like part of the consumable fuel for the fire, man, it did seem like the fire could burn for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, though, man, I mean, certainly, I certainly think that like a person's body fat percentage, if you will, is going to contribute to how well it burns and all this. And boy, when I'm saying this out loud, it just really sounds morbid. So again, if it kind of turns your stomach, I apologize, but it's just really fascinating to me. Yes, that explains how the body could burn relatively quickly.
I know where you're going.
But it doesn't explain how did it ignite?
Yeah.
And also, when the fat melts, why didn't it burn anything that it was on? Mm-hmm. Like, how does it explain the untouched things? Now, I don't know.
Which, by the way, this would be the equivalent of, I know we keep going back to this chicken, and again, sorry for your loss, Woody, but that would be the equivalent of you watching that chicken completely burn, especially when the fat starts burning and it just really gets hot. That would be, all these cases would be like that if most of the feathers were still intact.
Yeah.
Which is like, what's happening? There's got to be something. Well, and also I think the frustrating thing for the majority of, any of these scientists that have tried to sort of get into it and figure it out are the bodies are so badly, like, just completely obliterated that they can't really find any sort of ignition source or anything that, there's not really any evidence of,
right.
Yeah,
I mean, it's, I think, okay, there are probably some cases where a bunch of different elements kind of aligned to create this, like, quote unquote, perfect storm event that would cause something like this. I mean, you think about it, our bodies are full of some flammable things. Like, I mean, even though we're mostly composed of water, which kind of makes it difficult, our intestinal gases are flammable. Cadavers produce gases that are flammable. Apparently, like, even stacks of hay and stuff and compost heaps can build up enough heat for spontaneous combustion. Mm-hmm. Certain elements and compounds like pure sodium, for example, and, phosphorus can burst into flames when exposed to air. I mean, you have to store sodium, I want to say, like, in an oil substance or whatever, because, like, pure sodium will just light on fire if it's exposed to oxygen. I think the fats and oils in our body certainly provide excellent fuel for a fire.
That's
and maybe, static electricity or something nearby could have caused it. But it's just one of those mysteries, man, that, like, there hasn't really been a great explanation of how and why. I think some cases, yes, somebody just, like, fell asleep and, dropped their cigarette. It's all of the elements combined in order and to create an environment and a scenario where a body could burn up that hot that quick without burning everything else. That's the thing, right? It's kind of like, essentially like if you had like a bucket of diesel and you threw, I'm going to have to maybe fact check this here, but if you threw like a match into this bucket of diesel, the match would go out.
Right.
Because the
burning point is so
the
lower
energy required to ignite it is a lot, higher. And so like, I think that for a human body to, if it was going to burn slowly, yes, we have the fuel and the flammable gases and all that kind of stuff, but it's going to take a while for it to reach that sort of temperature at 3,000 degrees to completely, reduce it to ash, right?
Well, and also I think, like I was saying before, like where the scientist was sort of experimenting with like acetone, which is created in the body, especially with folks with that are fat-free dieting, have diabetes, alcoholism. This was his like eureka moment. But when he found that it could like burn it to ash, but it still took like at least 30 minutes to get to that point. I feel like these situations, if you have a fire that hot and it burned for 30 minutes, the house would go up, the apartment would go up. It wouldn't. Right. It still wouldn't explain like how tightly contained these accounts are.
Right.
In my mind, at least.
Yeah. I mean, it just doesn't make sense, Like, how could it keep from burning everything else?
Yeah.
It just seems very concentrated. And even like, I was reading too about static electricity. Like, I don't know if you've ever done this, but winter is a great time to kind of like take a look at this. But if you've ever had like one of those flannel blankets.
Oh, I love it.
And the lights are out and like all the static is just like, you can see
so cool.
These little like electricity sparks, man. And so like maybe all things considered, what about static electricity? Well, I read that the human body can, according to the Fire Protection Manual of the National Fire Protection Association, never knew it existed until today. The human body can accumulate a static charge of several thousand volts. Some people have been known to build up far greater charges, occasionally generating up to around 30,000 volts. Ordinarily, this electricity is harmlessly discharged through the hair, but in certain volatile situations, such as factories for combustible materials or hospital operating rooms that use gases as anesthetics or even, pure oxygen, these people can spark off explosions. But these explosions have never been known to burn one person to ashes, leaving the room and furnishings undamaged. In other words, everywhere you turn, it's just another question.
Right.
And so I think a lot of the other sort of suggestions and theories include things like fireballs, lightning, internal atomic explosions, laser beams, microwave radiation, which is interesting, high frequency sound, and even geomagnetic flux. But the mechanisms through which any of those would work are still unexplained, man.
Yeah, so this is, and I swear we're going to cover this one day, but I've had these sort of accounts with, what are typically called orbs or light phenomena, and I'm not really going to get into it now, but basically I would see these things years ago when I was staying in this particular loft space where I would see these like little glowing balls of light, and so they would kind of sort of wobble around. It did seem like there was some sort of something that was like sort of making decisions on what the thing would do. At the time, when I did a bunch of research into this, I kind of kept coming back to this sort of explanation of like, well, I believe that these things are, there's probably, and this is coming from a pretty big true believer, but I think I didn't feel like a malevolent sort of vibe from these things. I felt like it was something that like maybe we just haven't scientifically figured out yet. And I kept, in the research, I kept going to like plasma, basically. And plasma also is sometimes sort of tied in with like UFOs and light phenomena where it's like, and so when doing this, when doing the research for the spontaneous human combustion, I immediately kind of thought like, well, what if what if I would have actually reached out and like touched this thing? Like if it was plasma, which is like literally like concentrated energy, like would this have caused, what we think of as human combustion?
Man.
I don't know. It's really interesting.
It is interesting. Like, would it have, well, God, I mean, would you have combusted?
That's what I'm saying. And also, like, since it was this small thing, but I mean, again, when plasma is created, it's this massive amount of like sort of ball of energy. I mean, in my mind, and there could be some scientists out there who completely would say, no, it's this. But in my mind, it is small, but it's still like a massive amount of energy. It does seem like it would, or it could explain the tight, containment of this massive amount of flame or whatever. I don't know. It's just something that kind of
super interesting
that I thought of that was like, like maybe it was this thing. And again, I don't necessarily believe these days that like, I mean, obviously there's the orbs that you would see on like, in photos and, oh, well, that's like, moisture or that's this or that's this. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like when people will see these like, fit in the physical realm of like these balls of light that kind of wobble around and do their own thing. I just wonder if like, because you never really hear if people like reaching out and touching these things.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if
they get burned up, man.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I mean, it's interesting. Like, dude, I've never because like that was my main thing. Like, surely we must know, like maybe by now they've investigated some of these accounts and they've said, no, it's just this guy, this drunk ass was, just dropped a cigarette in a pile of hay and burned himself to death. Like
I thought the same thing. Yeah,
but dude, I didn't see anything about plasma. Which, and for non-science loving listeners, plasma is interesting because plasma is a mixture of electrons that are negatively charged and ions, atoms that have lost electrons, resulting in a positive electric charge. And it's not a gas. It's not a liquid. It's not a solid. It's actually the fourth state of matter. And here's what's interesting, dude. After you saying that, this sentence really kind of is like eye-opening to me. Plasma often behaves like a gas. Except that it conducts electricity and is affected by magnetic fields.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's pretty...
it could be so far off, but like...
Well, yeah, I know, but like, it is like...
it.
I feel like there probably is, and I mean, again, this is going to take more research and stuff, and maybe you listeners can kind of dive into it a little bit deeper, but I think that plasma exists like in air, right? And then if there's some sort of electromagnetic charge or something caused by something,
right?
Whether it is, because like, whoa, just hit my mic like it was a person that did something wrong. Like if you've been to the beach, like I keep on going back to this lady in 1951 in St. Petersburg, Florida. If you've been to the beach and you've had those late night or even sometimes mid-afternoon sort of heat lightning storms and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's something weird about the air, right? And like
it's like
I
charged.
Some of the phenomenon or whatever that occur kind of cause like isn't there something that like when the lightning strikes, there's like some sort of like plasma something that's created?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
God, I wish I knew. Now I sound like an idiot.
Well, and I'm going to sound like an idiot too, but because I don't know what I'm about to say. But there's also an association with when lightning strikes or like in the presence of, I think it is plasma, where there's like the smell of like ozone, which, get into Joshua Cutchin and the Brimstone, his book about, smells and associated with like the paranormal called The Brimstone Deceit. But yeah, I wonder if that is like part of it. I wonder if these like little, I don't know, stray or rogue balls of plasma, like maybe it is created in just out of thin air, like there's got to be something. I just feel like this is an area that definitely would have been immediately sort of shoved off to the side back in the day. But I feel like we are at a place now where we're able to, or at least science is able to be a little more abstract in thinking and sort of correlation. And it's funny because I wasn't going to bring it even up.
You got to, dude.
But I really think that, like, now that I'm thinking about it, it's like, fuck, man, like, there are all these crazy blue flames. That's plasma.
Yeah.
Maybe they're just, unlike me, like, reaching out and touching the thing. Like,
Or, dude, here's another crazy thing. Because, you know, we don't want to, like, discount, you know, there's a lot of theories about orbs and stuff. Some people think it's like, you know, visitors from another dimension or from beyond or, you know, spirits or whatever.
UFO drones.
Dude, what if our scientific sort of what we are able to use our own scientific knowledge to date to do is explain otherworldly phenomenon and even spiritual experiences with science, right? It's just our way of trying to figure it out, right? Well, who's to say, like, yes, maybe it is plasma, but maybe that's the way, maybe that energy, that's just how, do you understand what I'm saying? Like, that's how we can explain it. It's like, oh, well, it's plasma energy, but we don't know it past that, you know?
Which kind of takes me back to back in the old days, which I think they were probably also sort of explaining the look of plasma as like the ether. Like ether was like this sort of mysterious, universal.
Like, what if, like, and maybe it is like the key to time travel.
I mean, I think so, man.
And it's just like this powerful energy that, man, if you don't know how to use it, you're going to spontaneously combust, you know?
Well, and also, is this like dark energy or like, is it linked to like dark matter or, I mean, I'm sure CERN has it figured out, but.
I mean, I'm sure, like, imagine a way to, like, harness all of that plasma and use it to, man, I don't know, dude. That's so cool.
Huge weapons.
Anyway,
Or.
Okay.
No, I'm just going to say, or, I mean, what if our government / military, which obviously, you know, like black tech would be, they say it's like 20 years advanced more than like what the most advanced thing that we would see typically. I mean, what if these are like, this is basically how like energy weapons are used? Like, what if they're basically sort of harnessing that energy that we're talking about?
Yeah.
Don't think they had them in the 1600s, though.
But maybe the time travelers that were visiting back then did.
Okay, yes.
I'm just telling you, man, John Teeter was on a mission for something.
Yeah, he was. He was.
Yeah. I mean, I think looking into this plasma idea is a really cool thing to kind of investigate, man. I mean,
yeah, I think so too.
Look, I think the main important fact here is that this is one of those mysteries that is still a mystery, which, as you know, being a listener of this show, something that we love a lot. Not that we think we're going to figure it out. It's just we love to tell you guys about these kind of crazy phenomenon that exist out there. And if you listeners kind of know a little bit more about this or have really kind of, if this is your passion project, spontaneous human combustion, you know, and you know a lot more about it or have some theories of your own, man, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, we would.
Because, like I said, I love talking about this kind of stuff and hearing all kinds of different theories about how this could happen. And if you're even more specifically super science-minded and more of a realist, now I'm interested what you find in terms of what's been found. I couldn't find anything really of note that truly explains it. Yeah. In other words, I found a lot of stuff that kind of explains away some of the stuff, but not like explains how it happened then. You know what I mean?
Well, and also, to me, once you really start looking into it and like seeing just how fast these things happen and like how concentrated and contained these things are, it's weird. I think it's easy to find a lot of things that sort of would help the flame, you know, like somebody who's like soaked in alcohol that like does like alcoholics or like, you know, that kind of thing. But I don't know. Maybe it's something. Maybe it's not. But you know, that's what we have a show for.
Well, cool, man. I actually think this is a really cool episode.
Yeah, me too.
Well, we said it last week, and it feels really good to be back. We've got an exciting lineup of future shows ready to go and ready to rock and roll. But if there is a specific topic that you want us to cover or dive into deeper, maybe even one of our previous episodes, maybe a follow-up to, please just reach out and let us know. And Tyler, what are the ways that they can do that?
Well, most of our sort of activity is over on Instagram. We have a great little community over there. Feel free to jump in on the comments or shoot us a DM if you have a story. The username is That Would Be Rad. Feel free to share some stories or recommendations on stories. If you do have a long form story and you want to maybe send a voice recording or something like that, feel free to shoot it over to thatwouldberadpod@gmail.com. And yeah, we would love to hear from you. Go buy some merch in our link tree. And I guess that's about it, man. You got anything else?
I think that's it, man.
Cool, dude. Well, like we always say, we love you. We appreciate you. Do not catch on fire, folks. And as always,
be rad.
That's the way it
clouds in a time where I just needed some sunshine. You were already dead before you became a ghost. You always said our future would be a parade of flowers, but now all that's left is a single rose. That's the way it goes.
Let me see. Hold on.
What if we just kept this in? It's like us just thinking of what to say.
No.